Welcome to the Voices of Israeli Rabbis podcast. I'm your host, Rabbi Phil Cohen. In June 2025, I traveled to Israel, expecting to meet in person with some 10 Israeli rabbis. That journey, however, coincided with Israel's conflict with Iran, which meant I spent a good deal of time in my Airbnb shelter, and that travel around the country was ill-advised. As a result, I conducted all but one of these conversations from the relative comfort of my Airbnb. I came to realize that their lives and work were fascinating. More than that, they constituted a remarkable community whose contributions are little understood outside of Israel. I decided to devote this podcast exclusively then to Israeli rabbis and to share their stories with a world that often knows Israel only through the headlines. So I speak with rabbis from every stream of Jewish life and every corner of Israeli society. Thanks for joining me on this episode of the Voices of Israeli Rabbis podcast, as my guest and I build a permanent oral history of Israeli religious life, one conversation at a time. Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen is not easily categorized. An American-born Israeli, he made aliyah as a young man, served in the Israel Defense Forces, and today teaches at Machon Meir while also directing the English language desk for Brit Olam, an interesting organization that works with communities around the world who seek to live according to the Noahide laws. Influenced in his youth by the Jewish Defense League and later by the teachings of Harav Kook and Rabbi Yehuda Leon Ashkenazi, known as Manitou, Rabbi HaKohen argues that Zionism represents not merely a political movement, but the rebirth of the Hebrew nation. He also challenges Jews to decolonize themselves by shedding assumptions acquired during centuries of exile and recovering an authentic Hebrew identity. In this conversation, we explore some of the largest questions facing Israel and the Jewish people. What is Zionism ultimately trying to accomplish? How should Jews understand the relationship between religion and nation? How should Jews understand the relationship with Jews and Gentiles around the world, Christian and Muslim? What role does the state of Israel play in the unfolding of Jewish history? Whether you agree with Rabbi HaKohen's conclusions or not, you will encounter a thoughtful, intellectually ambitious vision of Israel that is unlike almost anything found in the American Jewish conversation. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen. So my next guest is Yehuda HaKohen. I discovered him quite by accident while looking up my previous guest. I saw my previous guest, Hanan Schlesinger, in conversation with Yehuda HaKohen. I thought it was so interesting. I'd like to see if I could get him to talk to me, and here he is. I really appreciate it. So thank you for being with me. It's 1:30 a.m. here in Florida and 8:30 a.m. in Israel. You got the better time. So Yehuda, nice to meet you.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. And I thought we'd start just by talking a little about your decision to make aliyah, where you were in the States. A couple of quick sentences about your aliyah and how you came to be doing what you're doing.
I was born in New York City to immigrant parents. My mother had come from the former Soviet Union. My father had actually come from Canada, so I don't know if we consider that to be an immigrant parent, but neither of them were Americans, and neither of them were born in the same country that their grandparents had been born in. Meaning the experience was that we were kind of homeless, and we had moved from place to place. And I guess because I was born at the end of 1979 and in New York City, so the experience or the Jewish identity I had growing up might have been more similar to Jews in New York a couple generations before me than it was to a lot of the Jews my age growing up in New York.
Because you were a child of immigrants, right? You shared their immigrant experience.
And a lot of my friends were also the children of immigrants. I had Albanian friends, Irish friends who were like from Ireland, Black friends, Puerto Rican friends who, I mean, the Puerto Ricans were fairly new. And even a lot of the Jews I had grown up around were just from Iran after the revolution. They kind of had to flee Iran or later on from the former Soviet Union who came after the Iron Curtain fell. So my experience was a little bit unique for a Jew in New York my age. And I grew up somewhat outside of the Jewish community. I think most of my friends as a teenager weren't Jews. And I think Jewish identity was very relevant because in the world I was growing up in, I was a rebellious kid and I had a lot of wild adventures and maybe what we can call dangerous friends. And in the world I lived in as a teenager, to be a Jew was really considered a liability. And in the same way that we can say a woman has to work harder than a man to get the same respect or the same pay in the workplace, a Jew in the world I grew up in had to be more violent than a black kid or more violent than an Irish kid to get the same respect.
What part of the city did you live in?
Yorkville.
Refresh my memory. Where is that?
So Yorkville today has just been gentrified into the Upper East Side, but it was that part of Manhattan, but kind of by the East River in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, just south of East Harlem. When I was growing up, it was mostly Irish and Albanian. Today, it's probably just drugstores and banks and high-rise apartment buildings. And again, I was a rebellious kid and I learned a lot about life as a teenager in New York City. This is what we can call pre-Giuliani New York. And even while he was mayor, I remember I was still, a teenager. And the city changed drastically. And I think it's changing again. I think New York constantly changes. But that Jewish identity component was very important to me because I had grown up with other kids who were Jews who were very closeted about it. As an adult, I still discover that some of the kids I grew up with were Jewish because they didn't want to represent that. They didn't want people to know they were Jews because they really saw it as a liability in that world. So because I don't want to get too deep into all the personal history, but because of an experience I had had in East Harlem when I was in 8th grade, from then on, I was very in people's faces about my Jewish identity, even if that meant I had to fight. And again, for me growing up, it was an ethnic identity. It was never really a religious identity.
What you're describing doesn't sound like New York in the 80s and 90s. It sounds more like the 40s or 50s. So you had a really different kind of experience in the cities. I mean, given the time you grew up in.
Right. It could just be the cultural environment I was in. Maybe there were times in my life where I feel behind the rest of the world, and there are times in my life where I feel ahead of the rest of the world. It depends on the issue, I suppose. But I definitely related to myself as a Jew in the way other people were Albanian or Puerto Rican, and not in the way that other people were Christian or Muslim.
You live on the West Bank. The way I saw you in your videos, you've become Orthodox. So
no,
you're not?
No, I would say that Orthodox. I mean, a lot of the project I'm involved in educationally is what we call decolonizing Jewish identity. It's applying post-colonial theory to Jewish issues. And I would say that, first of all, the concept of a religion called Judaism is already the colonization of our identity, something we did as a result of external coercion in Europe, meaning the Jews, in order to achieve inclusion and whiteness in places like Germany and France, kind of reframed our identities. And instead of being a people in exile with obviously a spiritual component to our identity and a legal component to our identity, it was a whole civilization that was destroyed by the Romans and shrunk. But we self-identified for roughly 1700 years in exile as a people in exile, as basically as Palestinian refugees. And it was only with the Haskalah, with the Enlightenment, that Jews, in exchange for inclusion, started to redefine ourselves as Germans with a religion called Judaism. That's really the invention of Judaism. And I would say that Orthodox Judaism, Reform Judaism, all of these denominations that came in the wake of the Haskalah were further expressions of this colonization and the Christianization of Jewish identity. Just like they had Protestants and Catholics and everything else, we kind of mimicked that by factionalizing into these denominations. So I would argue that the Orthodox Jews very zealously fought for the ritual and legal components of Jewish identity, but very much dropped the ball on the national and territorial components of Jewish identity. So in that way, I might, for example, be able to accept an Orthodox rabbi's giur, like if somebody became a Jew, if a non-Jew became a Jew through an Orthodox Beit Din, I could accept that person as a Jew because in terms of the ritual and legal components of our identity, they kept it intact. the way a lot of Orthodox Jews see themselves, understand their place in this world, what it means to be a Jew. I think they kind of lost the plot in terms of the meta-narrative of our people and the historic aspirations of our people in a way that I would argue, and this is an old argument actually between the Reform and the Orthodox. Once upon a time, the Reform, Abraham Geiger changed the Siddur to replace Jerusalem with Berlin. And his claim was that the Orthodox agree with me. Right? They also want to be in Berlin. They just are dishonest when they're in the synagogue and they say they want to go to Jerusalem. I want to be in Berlin, and I am in Berlin. And
Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was very much in that category you're talking about.
I would regard him as the father. I would say Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was the father of Orthodox Judaism. He's the inventor of Orthodox Judaism.
That's what he's credited with, at least what we call modern Orthodox Judaism, for sure. So we've already kind of gone off on the theoretical part of what I wanted to talk with you, which is great. But I want to take a step back. So you use the word colonization of the Jews. Now, first of all, this is what this is reminding me of. You know this book by Jean-Paul Sartre, The Anti-Semite and Jew?
No.
He says his main thesis in the book is pretty much what you said, is that Jewish identity is identified by the anti-Semite. The Jewish identity is always in response to anti-Semites' picture of the Jew. But I want you to focus a little bit more on use the word colonization of the Jew several times. It's interesting, but I don't quite understand yet what you mean by it.
First of all, our civilization was destroyed by the Roman Empire. For the most part, the Jews who had fought the Roman Empire, especially in the revolt of Bar Kokhba and Rabbi Akiva, those who survived were ultimately sold into slavery from Hebron, from the slave markets in Hebron, to Rome, became gladiators and slaves and all sorts of things. And that's really where Ashkenazi Jews come from. The Ashkenazim are basically the Jews who were displaced by the Romans to Rome, meaning to the belly of the beast, and from there ultimately migrated to places like France and Germany and Russia, etc. And I'm speaking specifically about the Ashkenazi experience because the other diasporas are a little different.
Yeah, because there was this other thriving civilization, in Babylonia.
Sure.
They were not conquered by the Romans.
Right. So our experience, specifically the Ashkenazi experience, was one of being deep inside the territory of our arch enemy, of those who had destroyed us, those who destroyed Jerusalem, and then those who sought to replace us, Christianity and all that. We went through several cycles of very traumatic persecution in different forms, in different places, but the pattern seems to just keep repeating itself. And it affected us in many ways. And I think when you look at a people, especially people as ancient as the Jews, you have to ask, well, what changes in identity were the result of cultural evolution, like any people might experience, versus external coercion, right? What things changed in our identity, in our culture, in how we live, how we see the world, how we see ourselves, etc., as a result of either others being cruel to us, others being violent towards us, or our internal fear of them being violent towards us. Explain what is this post-colonial conversation I think we have to have. Imagine, you grew up in North Carolina?
No, I grew up in near Philadelphia.
You grew up near Philadelphia. So let's just pretend that when you were 12 years old, your family's home was taken over by a bunch of ninjas. And you didn't like it, but they're ninjas and there's not much you can do. They rearranged your family's furniture. They outlawed whatever cuisine your family used to eat, whatever food your mother used to make. They replaced it with Japanese food. The music you were listening to was outlawed. You had to listen only to Japanese music. And after 5 years of this, you decide you have enough and you fight them and you actually win. You beat the ninjas at 17 years old. And now your house is free. Your family is free. So you have material freedom, but now your family has to have a conversation, 2 conversations actually. Number 1, you have to ask, where did the furniture used to be? And 2, you have to ask, do we or do we not want to put it back? Because that's an important question. It could be that the way the ninjas reorganized your house is actually objectively better. But you have to have the conversation. It could be that their music is the music of the oppressor on the one hand, but on the other hand, a lot of your coming of age experience took place against the backdrop of that soundtrack. So you might have nostalgia triggered by their music, and it's complicated. Their cuisine, Japanese food might be healthier for your body than Jewish food, right? Sushi might be better for you than kishka or corned beef sandwiches. But still, it's the food of the oppressor. So this is part of the conversation, and I think this is a conversation Israel has to have today. The Zionist movement attained material liberation for the Jewish people. We are stronger than we've been in thousands of years, right? But psychologically, we haven't caught up. And there are many things happening. And I think even the way we relate to power and sometimes misuse power is the result of us not catching up psychologically to the power we have militarily and materially and economically, et cetera. So I think that for us, it's very important because remember, when you look at any conflict in which the Jews are involved, we think of ourselves as punching up. The majority of Jews experience themselves as punching up, while the rest of the world sees us as punching down. Because we still haven't healed. We're still extremely traumatized. We haven't healed. We still see ourselves through the lens of our oppressors, the people who were our oppressors for thousands of years, which is basically the West. And we judge ourselves based on their lens, meaning even when we look at Israeli society and the way it functions, there's an assumption that especially Israel's ruling class and many diaspora Jews have, that Israel is only worthy if we can successfully hold ourselves up to the standards of the West, of what a liberal Western nation state should be. And to come up with our own structures and our own ways of organizing society and our own ways of relating to our neighbors is considered taboo, or it's scary, or maybe there's an assumption in some circles that if we were to do that, we would end up with a Jewish Iran. But I don't think that's true. I don't think we would end up with a Jewish Iran. I think now that we've come back, we have to ask ourselves, what makes a state Jewish? What does Jewish civilization look like in the 21st century? What's the place of the non-Jew in a Jewish society? And I think we're hopefully gaining now. I think part of this post-colonial conversation we need to have can give us the civilizational confidence to actually do what we came home to do.
I want to backtrack just a little bit because I'd like to know a little bit about your education. I mean, how it was you came to this set of ideas, and how it was you came to make aliyah, and how it is you chose to live on the West Bank. And then we can pursue this a little bit more in terms of the kinds of things I learned about you, namely your politics about a one-state solution. I may not use that term, and your peace work.
Unlike most of my friends, I finished high school. I have a high school degree, and to this date, that's my highest degree. I did 3 years of college. I was a sociology major at the Syracuse University. I finished all my major requirements. I was also a Judaic studies minor. I finished all my minor requirements, but I never finished college. I never got my degree, even though I completed all my major and minor requirements. So I guess I'm a sociologist by training. My second year of college, I discovered the internet. Right, which you could probably understand because you look a little older than I am. But when I speak, when I speak to younger people, it's like mind blowing that I discovered the internet my second year of college. But I did, and when I discovered the internet, I actually discovered something called the Jewish Defense League, which was a militant Jewish organization in the United States.
What year are we talking about?
We're talking about very late '99.
So this is well past Kahani.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was even still around in '99. So tell me about that.
Right. So I discovered them online. I didn't know what they were. I assumed it was like a Jewish gang or maybe like a Jewish Black Panther party, but it was intriguing based on my background, based on where I was coming from, how I grew up, what Jewish identity was for me. This looked like something that I'd be interested in. So I did something that was probably unwise to do on the internet. I contacted them on the internet and I met with them and I joined them. It was actually a very pivotal experience for me. It totally changed my life because that was my way back into the Jewish community. That was the way back into just, really being part of the Jewish people in a meaningful way. And it was, of course, I was radicalized and some for good, some for bad, but I'm grateful for it, long term. I ultimately became kind of like an educational director there. signing books to people and all of that. And that was a Torah that made sense to me, meaning like the Torah that made the most sense to me at the time was Rav Meir Kahana's Torah. That really spoke to my experiences and the way I grew up. It was a lot of common sense. A lot of the Jews I was encountering just didn't understand things that I considered basic common sense based on the world I grew up in. And this rabbi, or, he was no longer in the world, but these books and the audio tapes and all that seemed to understand those things. So that, of course, set me on a path. When the second Intifada started, I was still a college student, and I felt very uncomfortable with the idea that Jews my age in Israel were expected to pick up guns and go fight, while I, because I was born in the United States, was expected to go to college and earn a degree. So I thought that was wrong. I thought that it can't be that we're the same people, we're both Jews, but he's got to go to war and I got to go study in class. So I dropped out of school and I moved to Israel and I enlisted in the army, but I didn't go right from the airport to the army. It doesn't work that way. There's like a process and, an aliyah process and a draft process, etc. So I decided to go learn in the yeshiva. I went to a place called Machon Meir. I'm a teacher there now, but at the time I went to go learn there. I went right from the airport to there, actually. Machon Meir is a Rav Kook yeshiva. It's a yeshiva in the path of Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook and Rav Yehuda HaKohen Kook. I guess what we can call politically a Gush Emunim type of yeshiva, and very national religious, like hardcore national religious, very Kabbalistically influenced, and it was there that I really learned most of the Torah that I absorbed. And I was there for about a year and a half before I ultimately drafted. I was also very politically active at the time. Demonstrations for the freedom of Jonathan Pollard. I would bring diaspora Jewish students to places like Gush Katif in the Gaza Strip, Hebron, all these kind of, far out Jewish communities in the West Bank and Gaza that a lot of these students were afraid to go to. We would organize like weekend retreats there. We'd organize weekly lectures, of Zionist history and things of that nature in Jerusalem. I was extremely politically active at the time. And then even before I drafted into the army, I went up to a hilltop in the West Bank next to Kochav HaShachar to create a new Jewish community on that mountaintop. And then even the army unit I served in was actually Netzach Yehuda, which was the unit that the Biden administration was thinking about sanctioning. It was a unit that was originally created for Haredi students, for Haredi Jews. But when I was in the unit, I drafted into it in about 2003. It was mostly, a lot of hilltop youth, guys from Hebron, guys from Gaza, guys Breslov and Chabad, like Nanach Breslov and Chabad, very few actual Haredim. It was kind of an ideological unit. It definitely felt like I was in an ideological unit, maybe like the Jewish answer to Hezbollah in a way. And again, it was a unit I was very comfortable in at the time. And this is during the second Intifada. And by the time I finished, I was married. And we decided to move to East Jerusalem, to a neighborhood called Ras Al Amud, to create a Jewish community there, which is still there. It's called Maleh Zeitim. So I was there for 4 years in East Jerusalem. And one of the things that happened to me while living in East Jerusalem was I started to see the Palestinians up close in a real way. For me, I wasn't interested in living like a settler. I wanted to take my car to their garage. I wanted to shop in their grocery store. I wanted to walk around the neighborhood. I didn't want to feel like I have to come in under armed escort and live behind barriers. I wanted to be an organic part of the neighborhood. Some Palestinians were very receptive to this and curious about me. Some weren't. Some were very suspicious of me. But I started to see their story a little bit. Right? A little bit. And when you first see their story, before this, they were the enemy. When I came to Israel initially as a JDL activist, not just as a JDL activist, I think this is just the way the Western media depicts things. The Jews and the Arabs are at war. I'm a Jew. They're the enemy. I'm going to go fight. And it took me a while to see them as something other than the enemy and to realize that they have a story too. And they're in a really difficult situation. At first, a guy like me could do that by putting the blame on Arafat or Mahmoud Abbas and not saying it's Israel's fault in any way. And then as time goes on, it becomes easier to see what Israel contributes to the situation. And by the time I left that neighborhood, we left that neighborhood in 2009. I also have to say that we arrived there in 2005, only a couple months before George W. Bush and Ariel Sharon destroyed all the Jewish communities in Gaza. And that was a very traumatic experience for me. Like I was part of the resistance to the disengagement. We lost, obviously, but it wasn't just that we lost. I witnessed our whole sector of Israeli society, a sector of Israeli society that I was a part of, being demonized in the press, being, targeted by the police in ways that were extremely brutal and unjust. I think that we were considered enemies of the state. For that time, anybody who was in what we called the orange camp, who was against the disengagement, who was organizing against the disengagement from Gaza, was just treated like an enemy of the state, an enemy of Zionism, and crushed by the police, by the media, by the government. We saw government ministers fired to create an artificial majority in the cabinet for what Sharon wanted to do. We saw Sharon lose the Likud party referendum, but just pushed through anyway and reject the national referendum. We just saw democracy get thrown out the window completely in order for Ariel Sharon to do what Bush wanted him to do. That also really strengthened my conviction that at the core, the real problem is not this policy or that policy, but the fact that Israel is subjugated to the United States, that we can't act on our own interests, we can't chart our own course because Israeli policymakers are constantly either being told directly by the Americans or just internally concerned about the reaction of the Americans that we have to keep our policies in line with U.S. imperial interests in our region. So I saw all of this, whether it was a two-state solution, the disengagement from Gaza, all of these things were basically U.S. or U.S. and European imperialist policies in our region that we were the victims of. I soon learned Palestinians are also the victims of. I was very frustrated by the fact that many of the Jews in the national camp, many Israelis in the national camp who saw themselves as fighting for Judea and Samaria and Gaza, fighting for the land of Israel, didn't realize that the real problem was the United States, not the Palestinians. And I think a lot of the hostility directed towards the Palestinians was in many ways misplaced because they're also victims of this. And the truth is, we should probably, had we been smarter, we could have probably thwarted the disengagement by uniting with Palestinian forces who are also opposed to it at the time.
I'm not sure I buy totally the subjugation issue, but I have to think about that. But you see it all the time. The 1967 war ended, the 73 war ended. The current conflict with Hezbollah is being tamped down, all because of American insistence. Right about that.
I'll also say, by the way, that I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, my suspicion is that he's been very carefully and slowly and quietly working for years, maybe decades, to free Israel of the United States. And I think that will ultimately be his legacy. I think Netanyahu's legacy will be freeing Israel from the U.S.
Well, press that for a minute. How do you see that happening?
Well, first of all, the fact that we're now getting off the aid, we're going to stop taking money from the United States. I think that's a huge part of it, obviously. And we're just going to end our dependency. And I think that's something that Netanyahu initially, when he first raised this issue in the 1990s, he was met with tremendous opposition.
I see sort of two hinge moments in your life. One, discovering the JDL and your commitment to it, which is part and part brought you to Israel and the army. But then it's funny, the way you described your upbringing, and then you describe how you were living in East Jerusalem and started engaging with Palestinians in business and commerce, maybe friendship as well. It's
not so much business. We weren't doing much. I mean, I was taking my car to their garage and.
That's what I meant. I mean, commerce, not business so much. And it struck me that It struck me that your upbringing was kind of similar to what you did your life in East Jerusalem. You had this multicultural sort of I don't know about economically, but it was sort of rough and tumble multicultural life that made it easy for you to start looking at Palestinians as people and not strangers?
A lot of what I know about politics, I used to work in party politics. I worked on 3 election campaigns here. But a lot of what I know about politics, I learned just from gangs in New York City. And I really think that at the end of the day, nations are really just gangs with more expensive weapons. The relationship, the interaction between nations is almost identical to the interaction between gangs in an urban setting. Even the things they fight over, even the things that cause them to make peace or make alliances are all the same. It's really the same, just scaled up. I think nations are just scaled up gangs at the end of the day.
So getting back to sort of the post-colonial theory that you're working with and your peace work, I'd like to pivot into that. What are you doing for a living now? And how do you see the future, the future that you would like to see in Israel?
Professionally these days, I'm a teacher. I work in education. I'm not in party politics anymore. I'm somewhat politically active because I think that in Israel, education and politics often overlaps. I work for Brit Olam. I run the Vision Movement, which is pretty much the English language desk of Brit Olam.
Tell us about Brit Olam. What's Brit Olam?
Brit Olam is an organization under the leadership of Rav Uri Sherki, who's one of the most important public intellectuals in Israeli society. He comes from the Beit Midrash of Rav Kook. He was a student of Rav Tzvi Yehuda, also a student of Manitou and Rav Ashlag. It's an organization that's involved in several things within Israeli society. Probably the most interesting are really trying to very deeply mend relations between the Jewish people and the Islamic world. And also, Brit Olam has a very vibrant Noahide movement of non-Jews around the world who believe that the Torah is true, believe the Torah is prophecy, and don't want to become Jews. They think something incredible is happening in history because the people of Israel, the characters from the Bible, came back to their land after 2,000 years of exile and have been the center of world attention ever since, pretty much. And they want to be part of that. They want to be allies to the people of Israel without becoming Jews themselves. So we have Noahites on 6 continents around the world.
So define what Noahide is, please.
A Noahide is basically a human being who believes that the Creator gave a Torah to the people of Israel, and that Torah has 7 laws for all of humanity to live by, and that regardless of their cultural context, whether they're living in India, Japan, the United States, Germany, those 7 laws can basically provide a basic moral framework, but within the context of their own culture and their own, who they are, not having to change who they are. The yeshiva I teach in Jerusalem, Machon Meir, where I used to learn, it's an Israeli yeshiva, but it has an English program, a Russian program, a Spanish program, a French program, and a Gior program. So a lot of my students are non-Jews who are becoming Jews, who are in the process of becoming Jews.
Gior means?
Well, I think the mistranslation of Gior is conversion. But the word conversion implies that somebody's changing their religion. I think a more accurate way to describe it in English would be a naturalization. It's an ancient way for a person who's not part of the nation of Israel to join that nation, to join that.
Nice. I like that. That's nice. This is, I knew about Brit Olam a little bit because I saw, I did that. I did sufficient research to know that you're affiliated with that organization, but it sounds like it's a really pretty substantial organization. How is it funded?
Fundraising is hard. I'm happy to report that fundraising is not my job, but there are a lot of people who support Rav Sherki's work and support Brit Olam and want to donate to the things we're doing. And we're hoping to partner with certain government ministries to be able to do things that haven't been successful so far. A lot of the emphasis there is on the Jewish-Islamic relations, not in the sense of just kind of having a vegetarian meal and pretending nobody really knows anything for sure, so let's just kumbaya, but a real deep conversation about how can we, as the people of Israel, look at Muslims as Noahides, and how can Muslims, through their own texts, through the lens of their own scriptures look at the people of Israel as Muslims, not as the Jews, but as the people of Israel, the children of Israel, because those are two different identities in Islam. And what kind of partnership? Meaning, I think one could argue that Avraham, our ancestor, had two missions in life. The first, we can say, was Islam. It went to his eldest son, Ishmael. And the second was to create a nation. That went to his second son, Yitzchak. And I think ultimately, the first mission of creating a world religion for humanity to bring human beings close to the Creator, that's good. Islam could be very good. And that second mission to create a nation that'll be a holy nation in a very specific geographic territory and show the world that all of the material realities of nationhood can be uplifted to righteousness and holiness. I think those two missions can really dovetail if we can figure out our relationship.
And the folks at Yeshivat Meir,
Machon Meir.
This is a way of thinking that they agree with.
Some more than others. I think that, again, Rav Sherki is also a senior lecturer at Machon Meir in the Israeli department, and I think in the French department as well. So this current exists there. I would say most of the rabbis, especially the older rabbis there, are personal students of Rav Yehuda HaKohen Kook, who was also the spiritual, he was the Rosh Hashiva at Merkaz Harav, and the spiritual leader of Gush Emunim, which spearheaded the effort to create Jewish communities in the West Bank and Gaza after the Six-Day War. So I think the questions like our relationship with Islam or even our relationship with the Palestinians is very peripheral to Rav Kook's core ideological message, and therefore there are a lot of paths we can take, and I think that so long as we're not compromising or betraying any of the core ideological tenets of Rav Kook's Torah, there's a lot of space to have very positive relations with the Palestinians, with the Islamic world. Those are two different categories, by the way, because a lot of Palestinians are, of course, not Muslim, but I'm saying our neighbors more broadly.
But you're talking about developing Noahide relationships with Gentiles, Muslims, and others as Noahides. How that reflects how that reflects or creates a decolonized Jew.
Well, first of all, I think it goes the other way around. I think to be able to have a healthy, positive relationship with the outside world, with the non-Jewish world, whether it's Muslims, whether it's Noahides, whether it's anybody, we have to first know who we are. There are a lot of ways I could try to explain this, but I'm trying to think of the shortest.
Please do.
One could say, if you look at the Targum Onkelos, which is an ancient Aramaic translation of the Torah, right? It's from the 1st century, and Yemenite Jews continue to chant it in their synagogues after the Hebrew Torah reading. They do the Aramaic translation, what they call the Tarjum. And in the Targum Onkelos, it's interesting, whenever the Tanakh refers to our non-Jewish allies, like the Kenites, for example, the Kenim, it refers to them as either Muslimai or Islamai, meaning this term, and this is the 1st century, where this is
5 centuries before Islam.
The fact that this word, both these words, Muslim and Islam, seem to be present in ancient Jewish texts. The Targum Onkelos, as the Aramaic translation of the Torah, was probably like the art scroll of the ancient world. I would argue that if Muhammad had access to the Torah, he had it in Aramaic, in the Aramaic language, because that's what most people spoke in the region at the time. And if that's the case, I think a strong argument could be made that Muhammad was trying to create a Noahide religion, that the motivating force behind Islam was to recreate Abraham's first mission, a religion to bring people close to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Now, the problem, and this is not Muhammad's fault, but the problem is he tried to do this at a time when the Jews had no power, when the Jews were in exile. And I don't think you can create a successful Noahide movement unless the Jews are powerful and active on the stage of history. Like, there needs to be the people of Israel in our land with self-determination to be able to have the correct relationship with the rest of humanity, including the Islamic.
going. But I guess I want to ask you if you could create an ideal future, what would that be?
So when I started doing this work, probably 2009, when I moved from Malé Zeytin to Bethel, I thought it was important to bring the Jews who are most consciously living the Jewish story, the Jewish meta-narrative, in contact with Palestinians. It was very clear we didn't understand them, and they don't understand us. So when we started doing this work, we were considered alternative for three reasons. The first reason we were considered alternative was because we completely, on principle, rejected the two-state paradigm. We were against any division of our land. In fact, I wanted Gaza back. I still want Gaza back. And we also wanted to circumvent the international community. We didn't want funding from Christian Zionists. We didn't want funding from European governments. We didn't want any outside actors involved in our work. We were only interested in Jews and Palestinians leading this work. So the first reason we're alternative is we're completely circumventing the peace industry, which is all these NGOs funded by European governments pushing a two-state solution. We're not that. That's the first reason we're alternative. Second reason was because we claimed that you can't solve this conflict by bringing the westernized diplomats from both sides to sign an American piece of paper. We need to bring not the moderates, but the quote unquote extremists, those on each side willing to fight, kill, and die for what they believe to be important to their national stories. And we believe that only these people, only the extremists, can actually make peace in a real way, in a lasting way. And the third reason we're considered alternative is because we believe that there's no way to end this conflict while forcing either side to compromise on something that we believe to be fundamentally important to us. The only way to solve this conflict is to create a reality that feels like a happy ending in both narratives, subjectively. This is based on the claim that we're not living in the same movie. Palestinians and Israelis have been living in two completely different movies for the last 100 years. We have two completely different conceptions of reality, conceptions of our own identities, of the other's identity, of what this conflict is about, why we're fighting. I think for the most part, Israelis see this as a conflict between two competing nationalisms. And I think for the most part, Palestinians experience this as an anti-colonial struggle. We have two different ways of understanding national identity. The way Jews define our own identity is usually, the descendants of a very specific set of ancestors buried in Hebron, a family that grew into 12 tribes, that grew into a nation, plus those who joined us along the way through a process that allows outsiders to become insiders. And for Palestinians, their identity, in my experience, is just the indigenous peoples of Palestine throughout time, including the Jebusites and the Canaanites and the Philistines and even the ancient Israelites and even crusaders who just stuck around and absorbed into the population. So we often argue past each other. We don't understand each other. And I think that a lot of our work was geared to, it was kind of like narrative therapy, helping the Jews and Palestinians involved in the work to really be able to engage with the identity, the narrative, the grievances and aspirations of the other without feeling their own identities or own narratives threatened. And I think part of the problem is that on both sides, in Israeli society and in Palestinian society, it's perceived as an act of weakness or maybe even betrayal to try to understand the other. And as a result, I think we both keep fighting past each other. We're both adopting counterproductive methods of struggle that are really geared towards defeating the other as he exists in our fantasy rather than as he exists in reality. So even if the goal was to win and not reconcile, I think we have an interest in trying to understand them from their own perspective, and them, us. But we're not doing that. But a lot of this work was geared towards trying to do that. And I think that if we understand each other, and if we can appreciate the fact that we're living in two completely different movies, we can create a one-state reality between the river and the sea that allows both peoples to feel like winners in our respective narratives. And that would probably require us to make the Jewish character of the state much deeper than it is right now, but at the same time, much softer. I would say right now the state of Israel is like a European-style nation state with Jewish decorations. Those Jewish decorations are very hard and shallow. They're too shallow for the Haredim, right? The Haredi Jews see the state as not really that Jewish in any meaningful way. And they're important because the Haredim are the fastest growing population between the river and the sea. We ultimately want to convince them that this is a real Jewish state. And I think the Jewish character of the state is way too hard and way too othering for Palestinians. So I think instead of a hard, shallow Jewish identity, we need a deep, soft Jewish identity that every Haredi child will recognize the Jewishness in the policies and institutions of the state. And Palestinians will barely notice the Jewishness at all, but just experience a democratic society where they're fully included.
So how's that going?
Well, that's not the direction society's taking. No, those are my ideas and maybe some of the ideas that we organized around. A lot of our peace work really stopped around COVID, and certainly during this war. There's very little appetite on either side for reconciliation right now. That's just the situation we're in. I'm hoping that can change. I do see the silver lining is that Israeli society has really advanced as a result of the last couple of years of war. I think that Israeli society has really matured in some ways that make us more capable of having these conversations than before. Like it used to be that I would say, okay, this is what I think Israelis and Palestinians need to do in order to make peace. But unfortunately, Israeli society isn't ready. I could say Palestinians were more ready than we were, but we weren't ready. I think we're more ready today. That doesn't mean that the possibility exists to really talk to each other under the circumstances and the last couple of years of war. But I think that when the smoke clears and people are able to lick their wounds, I'm hoping that we can engage differently. I also will argue that the sector of Israeli society that should be leading our relationship with our neighbors are the more extreme elements in the West Bank. I'll say it like this. The relationship between what we call the Jewish extremists, even the violent ones, or maybe especially the violent ones, in the West Bank, the relationship between them and the Palestinians is really, in their own minds, a relationship between two tribes at war, two tribes living next to each other at war. That's how they're experiencing things. Whereas I think the relationship dynamic between, let's say, the more westernized Israelis in Tel Aviv and the Palestinians is more of a colonizer-colonized dynamic. And I don't think a colonizer and a colonized subject can ever really make peace. But I do believe that two tribes at war can make peace and can become allies. So ultimately, I think the best peacemakers Israel really has are the violent extremist elements in the West Bank. They just need to be redirected towards leading reconciliation efforts.
It's an interesting challenge. I'd like to see it at work. You take two really Pabrenta enemies of each other and make them into allies. It's interesting. Thanks for listening to the Voices of Israeli Rabbis podcast. I hope you enjoyed the program. Stay tuned for future episodes as, with the help of my guests, I continue to unpack the diverse lives of rabbis who have made Israel their home. Please give the podcast a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow the audience of people interested in the lives, hopes, and dreams of the life of the Jewish state. Special thanks to Steve Lubetkin of Lubetkin Communications for engineering this episode. You can reach me at Rabbi Phil Cohen at ravphilmcohen@gmail.com. That's RAVPHILM.COHEN, ravphilm.cohen@gmail.com. See you next time.